Madam President, as soon as I possibly can, I intend to bring up an amendment which calls for transparency at the Fed. And I must tell you that this amendment is one of the more unusual amendments that has been brought up here in the Senate, I suspect, for many, many years because of the rather strange coalition that has come together around this amendment. How often do we have the AFL-CIO, a progressive organization, and FreedomWorks, a very conservative organization, supporting the same effort? How often are the SEIU, the largest union in America, MoveOn.org, some 5 million members, as a progressive organization, Public Citizen, another progressive organization, striving for the same goal as the National Taxpayers Union, or the Eagle Forum, or Americans for Tax Reform, very conservative organizations? And how often do you have some of the most progressive members in Congress, and I include myself within that fold, working with some of the more conservative members? Doesn't happen every day, but that is what is happening on this amendment. And I want to talk just for a few minutes about this amendment, what it does, and why so many diverse groups representing tens and tens of millions of Americans are coming together in support of it. And I also want to suggest to you what it does not do and some of the ways that it has been distorted by the Fed and other groups that are opposed to it. And I have seen some of the statements made by the Fed which are just absolutely untrue in terms of what this amendment does and does not do. Madam President, the origin for me The origin of this amendment came on March 3rd, 2009, when, as a member of the Budget Committee, I asked the chairman of the Fed, Bernanke, a very simple question. I asked him if he would tell me and the committee and the American people which financial institutions received over $2 trillion in zero interest or near zero interest loans during the start of the economic crisis, during the bailout period. Some $2 trillion of taxpayer money was lent out, and my question was, Mr. Chairman, who received that money? I don't think that that is an unfair question. You and I, Madam President, have heard great debates here on the floor of the Senate about $5 million or $10 million. To ask who received over $2 trillion in zero or near zero interest loans is something that I think should be answered by the Fed, and they should make that information public. But Mr. Bernanke said no. He gave his reasons, and on that very day, I introduced legislation that would require the Fed to put this information on its website, make it public, just like Congress required the Treasury Department to do with respect to the $700 billion TARP program. You may like TARP, you may not like TARP, you may vote for it, you may not, but the information about who received the money, when it was paid back, etc., is right there on the website of the Treasury Department. Madam President, this $2 trillion in zero or near zero interest loans does not belong to the Fed. It belongs to the American people, and the American people have a right to know where trillions of dollars of their taxpayer dollars are going. That's not complicated. You don't need an MBA from Wharton to know that. And that is why millions of Americans, whether you're conservative, whether you're progressive, or whether you are in between, have come together to say that we need transparency at the Fed. Madam President, this amendment not only requires that the Fed tell us who has received the $2 trillion it lent out in the midst of the financial crisis, but similar to the language incorporated in The House bill, it's already in the House bill, it calls for an audit of the Fed by the GAO. And as we all know, the GAO is the nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, who does a great job in trying to figure out where there is waste and fraud within our government. And that's it, Madam President. This is a very, very simple, short amendment. I think it's 5 pages. It calls for transparency at the Fed and a straightforward audit. Who got what? When did they get it? On what basis? On what terms? Who was at the meetings? Who made the decisions? And were there conflicts of interest? Simple, factual questions that the American people deserve answers to. That's what it is. It's not complicated. Madam President, I understand that this amendment will not be supported by everyone. Some may suggest inaccurately that this amendment, and I quote, because I've heard this statement already, takes away the independence of the Federal Reserve and puts monetary policy into the hands of Congress, end of quote. Let me address those concerns by simply reading exactly what is in the amendment. This is not complicated. And I quote from page 4 of the amendment. This is what it says. I don't think it could be more straightforward than this. Quote, nothing in this amendment shall be construed as interference in or dictation of monetary policy by the Federal Reserve System, by the Congress, or the Government Accountability Office, end of quote. You can't be more straightforward than the language in this amendment. So when people tell you that this amendment is going to interfere and have Congress dictate monetary policy, it is simply not true. In other words, Madam President, this amendment does not take away the quote-unquote independence of the Fed, and it does not put monetary policy into the hands of Congress. This amendment does not tell the Fed when to cut short-term interest rates or when to raise them. It does not do that. It does not tell the Fed what banks to lend money to and what banks not to lend money to. It does not tell the Fed what foreign central banks they can do business with and which ones it cannot do business with. It does not impose any new regulations on the Fed, nor does it take any regulatory authority away from the Fed. It does none of those things, no matter what anybody coming to the floor may say. Madam President, what the opponents of this amendment are doing is equating independence, which we support, with secrecy, which I do not support. At a time when our entire financial system almost collapsed, we cannot let the Fed continue to operate in the kind of secrecy that they have operated in for years. The American people have a right to know. You know, Madam President, very often we see senators coming down here to the floor and they make the point that the American people, working people, have to play by the rules. Play by the rules. How often have we heard that rhetoric? Well, what are the rules governing the Fed? Who makes those rules? Or do they just make them up as they go along? Madam President, let me just list a very few of the questions that millions of Americans are asking, members of Congress are asking, that a GAO audit might help to answer. Let me just rattle off a few of them, and I'm sure that there are many, many more. Question: why was Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, invited to the New York Federal Reserve to meet with federal officials in September of 2008 to determine whether AIG would be bailed out or allowed to go bankrupt? I wasn't invited to that meeting. I don't think you were invited to that meeting. Lloyd Blankfein was invited to that meeting. When the Fed and Treasury decided to bail out AIG to the tune of $182 billion, Why did the Fed refuse to tell the American people where that money was going? Why did the Fed argue that this information needed to be kept secret, quote, as a matter of national security, end of quote? When AIG finally released the names of the counterparties receiving this assistance, how did it happen that Goldman Sachs received $13 billion of this money, 100 cents on the dollar on what AIG owed them? How did that happen? I don't know. You don't know. American people don't know. But I think we have a right to know. Did Goldman Sachs use this money to provide $16 billion in bonuses to their top executives the next year? All over this country, Americans have lost their jobs, they've lost their homes, they've lost their savings, they've lost their ability to send their kids to college because of this recession caused by Wall Street. And yet Goldman Sachs gets $13 billion, 100 cents on the dollar, after AIG is bailed out at a meeting in which Lloyd Blankfein is at that meeting. I think it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but I think the American people have a right to know. A GAO audit of the Fed might help explain to the American people if there were any conflicts of interest surrounding that deal. Who got what? On what basis? On what terms? Who was at the meetings? Who made the decisions? And were there conflicts of interest? Madam President, in 2008, it seems to me, I didn't go to Harvard Business School, but it does seem to me that there was an apparent conflict of interest at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York with Stephen Friedman, the head of the New York Fed, who also served on the board of directors of Goldman Sachs. Let me repeat it. He was the head of the New York Fed. He also served on the board of directors of Goldman Sachs. And the New York Fed approved Goldman's application to become a bank holding company, giving it access to cheap loans from the Federal Reserve. Let me quote from an article published in the Wall Street Journal on May 9th, 2009, and let the American people determine whether or not this deserves a GAO audit. Quote, Wall Street Journal, Goldman Sachs received speedy approval to become a bank holding company in September of 2008. During that time, the New York Fed's chairman, Stephen Friedman, sat on Goldman's board and had a large holding in Goldman stock, which, because of Goldman's new status as a bank holding company, was a violation of Federal Reserve policy. The New York Fed asked for a waiver, which, after about 2.5 months, the Fed granted. While it was weighing the request, Mr. Friedman bought 37,300 more Goldman shares in December. They have since risen 1.7 million in value. Mr. Friedman, who once ran Goldman, says none of these events involved any conflicts, end of quote, Wall Street Journal, May 9th, 2009. Well, maybe Mr. Friedman is right. Maybe there's not a conflict of interest. Seems to me like there's a very apparent conflict of interest, but that is an issue that maybe a GAO audit might want to look at. Madam President, as a result of the bailout of Bear Stearns and AIG, the Fed now owns, this is pretty amazing, now owns credit default swaps, betting that California, Nevada, and Florida will default on their debt. Let me repeat that. Senators from California, Nevada, and Florida might be interested in this. As a result of the bailout of Bear Stearns and AIG, the Fed now owns credit default swaps, betting that California, Nevada, and Florida will default on their debt. So Federal Reserve stands to make money if California, Nevada, and Florida go bankrupt. What can I tell you? This is the reality. I know it will seem strange to the American people that the Fed makes money and is betting that 3 of our great states go bankrupt. Madam President, this may make sense to the Fed, may make sense to some of my colleagues here in the Senate. It does not make sense to me, and frankly, I do not believe that it makes sense to the American people. But this is what an audit of the Fed will allow us to better understand whether we want the Fed to be betting against some of our great states that they will go bankrupt. Madam President, it has been reported that the Federal Reserve pressured Bank of America into acquiring Merrill Lynch, making this financial institution even bigger and riskier, allegedly threatening to fire its CEO if Bank of America backed out of this merger. When the merger went through, Merrill Lynch's employees received $3.7 billion in bonuses. Was this a good deal or a bad deal for the American taxpayer? Perhaps a GAO audit can help us find out. Madam President, when the Fed provided a $29 billion loan to J.P. Morgan Chase to acquire Bear Stearns, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, Mr. Diamond, served on the board of directors at the New York Federal Reserve. Let me repeat that. When the Fed provided a $29 billion loan to J.P. Morgan Chase to acquire Bear Stearns, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, Mr. Diamond, served on the board of directors at the New York Federal Reserve. Did this represent a conflict of interest? To my mind, it does. Maybe I am wrong, but that's what a GAO audit can help explain to the American people. And again, I know that we're going to have senators running down here saying, oh, we're trying to break the independence of the Fed. We are not trying to do that. What we are trying to do is allow the American people to get a glimpse and an understanding of some of the actions of the Fed involving huge sums of money. Madam President, currently some 35 members of the Federal Reserve's Board of Directors are executives at private financial institutions which have received nearly $120 billion in TARP funds. But, Madam President, we don't know how much these big banks receive from the Fed. A GAO audit could answer that question. Madam President, and here's a very interesting point that I know a lot of senators have raised in different contexts, but if the goal of the huge amounts of money in Fed loans, trillions of dollars in Fed loans to large financial institutions, was to achieve the goal of getting credit flowing to small and medium-sized businesses that were cash-starved, that were crying out for credit, why is small business lending in free fall? What happened? We gave the large financial institutions trillions of dollars, presumably to get out to small, medium-sized businesses. They haven't gotten it. Question. I think it's a reasonable question. I'm not the only one who's asking it. How much of those zero-interest or near-zero-interest loans that these huge financial institutions receive from the Fed was simply invested in federal government bonds earning an interest rate of 3 or 4%. In other words, are we looking at a huge scam? And I can't think of a better word. You give these large financial institutions trillions of dollars in zero-interest loans in order to enable them to provide desperately needed loans to small and medium-sized businesses so those businesses can expand and create jobs, yet that appears not to be happening. Question, how much of those those several trillion dollars in loans simply went from the Fed to the financial institutions in order to purchase government-backed obligations at 3 or 4%. And if that's the case, that's just giving away money. Zero interest coming in, you get 3 or 4% guaranteed by the faith and credit of the United States of America. Well, you know what? I don't know. I don't know how much. I suspect, other people suspect, that that was done. How much? I don't know. Maybe the GAO can tell us. Madam President, this amendment is virtually identical to legislation that I've offered on this subject that has 33 co-sponsors. And just as we have a very broad spectrum of political ideology from grassroots organizations on the left and the right, conservative, progressive, Democrat, Republican, supporting this amendment, so we have had widespread, across ideology, support for this legislation. Let me just mention who the 33 co-sponsors are, and you will see how people with very different political ideologies have come together. And the names of those people are Senators Barrasso, Bennett of Utah, Boxer, Brownback, Burr, Cardin, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Dorgan, Feingold, Graham, Grassley, Harkin, Hatch, Hutchinson, Inhofe, Isaacson, Landrieu, Leahy, Lincoln, McCain, Murkowski, Risch, Sanders, Thune, Vitta, Webb, Wicker, and Wyden. Those are the people who supported the legislation. This amendment coming to the floor has 20 co-sponsors, Republicans and Democrats alike, and I want to thank all of those 20 senators for their support. Madam President, in terms of progressive grassroots organizations, this amendment enjoys the strong support of the AFL-CIO, the SEIU, the largest union in America, the United Steelworkers of America, Public Citizen, the New America Foundation, the Center for Economic Policy and Research, the Roosevelt Institute, the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, and Americans for Financial Reform, which in itself is a coalition of over 250 consumer, employee, investor, community, and civil rights groups. And let me just read you a letter of support that I received for this amendment from Bill Samuel, the legislative director of the AFL-CIO. And this is what the AFL-CIO said, and I quote, "On behalf of the AFL-CIO, I am writing to urge you to support," this is a letter going out to other senators, "urge you to support the Sanders, Feingold, DeMint, Leahy, McCain, Grassley, Vitta, Brownback amendment to increase transparency at the Federal Reserve. Working people want to know who benefited from the liquidity provided by taxpayers during the crisis, and this amendment will ensure that we receive this information," end of quote, AFL-CIO. Let me also quote from a letter I received from Andy Stern, the president of the SEIU, the largest union in the country, also from Leo Gerard, the president of the Steelworkers Union, and a number of other academics and economists. And this is what they write, and I quote, "Since the start of the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve has dramatically changed its operating procedures. Instead of simply setting interest rates to influence macroeconomic conditions, it rapidly acquired a wide variety of private assets and extended massive secret bailouts to major financial institutions. There are still many questions about the Fed's behavior in these new activities. The Federal Reserve balance sheet expanded to more than $2 trillion, along with implied and explicit backstops to Wall Street firms that could cost even more. Who received the money, against what collateral, on what terms and conditions? The only way to find out is through a complete audit of the Federal Reserve. That is why we support the Sanders, Feingold, DeMint, Leahy, McCain, Grassley, Vitta, Brownback amendment to increase transparency at the Fed," end of quote. That's what leading progressive economic and social justice organizations are saying about this amendment. And let me briefly, if I might, quote from some of the conservative organizations. And one of the larger ones is the National Taxpayers Union. I don't usually quote from the National Taxpayers Union. I think I'm not rated very highly on their chart, but this is what they say in support of this amendment, and I quote, "The National Taxpayers Union urges all senators to vote yes on S Amendment 3738 to the financial regulatory reform legislation This amendment, introduced by Senator Sanders and the Mint, would require the Government Accountability Office to conduct an audit of the Federal Reserve. Transparency is not a Democrat or Republican issue, but rather an issue of right or wrong. If the Senate insists on further expanding the Fed's reach, Americans deserve to know more about the workings of a government-sanctioned entity whose decisions directly affect their economic livelihood. A yes vote on S. Amendment 3738 will be significantly weighted as a pro-taxpayer vote in our annual rating of Congress. End of quote. That's from the National Taxpayers Union. We have also support from other conservative organizations, including Americans for Tax Reform, Campaign for Liberty, the Rutherford Institute, Eagle Forum, Freedom Works, and the Center for Fiscal Accountability. And I will submit to the record some of their statements. Let me just conclude saying a few other words. And that is, Madam President, this amendment is not a radical idea. I've just indicated to you that you have progressive groups representing millions of people. You have conservative groups representing millions of people. The AARP, the largest senior group, representing, I think, tens of millions of Americans. I should also mention to you that as part of the budget resolution debate in April of 2009, the Senate voted overwhelmingly in support of this basic concept by a vote of 59 to 39. In the House of Representatives, this concept passed the House Financial Services Committee by a vote of 43 to 26 and was incorporated into the House version of Wall Street reform that was approved by the House last December. In other words, a lot of what we are saying here, what I'm talking about, is in the House bill, not a radical concept. This idea has the support of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who said that Congress should ask the Fed to put this information, quote, on the Internet like they've done with the recovery package and the budget, end of quote. And that's what this amendment does. This concept has also been supported, and this is important, and I know my friend from Texas wants to speak. I'm winding down, and I apologize for going on this long, but it's important to point out that this concept has also been supported by two federal courts that have ordered the Fed to release all of the names and details of the recipients of more than $2 trillion in Federal Reserve loans since the financial crisis started as a result of a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit filed by Bloomberg News. Mr. President, Madam President, Mr. President, see, you've become a man now. All right, it's Mr. President. The Fed has argued in court that it should not have to release this information, citing, according to Reuters, quote, an exemption that it said lets federal agencies keep secret various trade secrets and commercial or financial information, end of quote. This is what the U.S. Appeals Court in New York said in disagreeing with the Fed, and I quote, "It's a unanimous three-judge appeals court." This is what they wrote in their opinion: to give the Fed power to deny disclosure because it thinks it best to do so would undermine the basic policy that disclosure, not secrecy, is the dominant objective. If the board believes such an exemption would better serve the national interest, it should ask Congress to amend the statute. So let me conclude by saying this. We now have 59 senators having voted for transparency, 320 members of the House, and 2 U.S. courts. All we want to know is who got trillions of dollars. That's what we want to know. We want to know also on what basis, on what terms, who was at the meetings where key decisions were made. Mr. President, this is an important amendment, and it is an amendment that millions of people want to see passed. And I hope that we will have an opportunity to offer it as soon as possible, and I hope that it is passed. I yield the floor, Madam.